assigned all the hard work.
There you go.
Hey, Carolyn, it's good to see you.
Because I didn't know. I don't think I've ever phone conferenced, and that threw me for a loop right there.
It's old technology. It's perfect for people our age.
No.
It was actually a lot easier than this is.
And this is super easy.
The dog wants something.
Hey, Jametta.
Hey, tilt your camera.
I'm gonna make you co-host as well. I'm gonna have to leave a little bit early. So is that okay with you?
Sure, no problem.
Are you feeling better?
Yes, much better. I'm going to venture out tomorrow.
Yes, good for you.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear it was just sinus, although sinus is a drag.
Yeah, but I was really happy. And I was glad the results didn't take so long to come back.
Yeah, you were lucky. I mean, because that when I had to go through that 2-week period.
Now, at some point here, I don't know what time, I thought she'd already be here, but my granddaughter's coming.
I'm glad I made people co-hosts.
Always longer for me to prepare than I expect. So I'm going to have to leave just for a second or two to take it out of the oven.
We don't want anything to scorch.
No, I mean,
especially us.
Country's burning as it is. We don't need my dinner to burn, right?
Well, we're still early. Isn't this great? We're all early.
Yeah. Yes.
So have you got some really neat things planned for Chris's first Sunday back in the pulpit?
Yeah, he's going to be doing a lot of juggling. He's got some dogs that'll walk on their hind legs. And
what? Are you sure it's not Unitarian Universalist who are walking on their hind legs?
Actually, there's been a change since Chris was gone. He's now become Pentecostal, and so we will be having more services similar to Church of God.
You'll be speaking and
he's going to have a Trump rally.
He's handling snakes.
No, Doris
he's going to have a Trump rally.
Doris was talking about we're the only snake handling church because she's brought her snake in to visit, and then she brought her snakes in for the Alliance. So we've had her snakes in church.
There are a lot of people who are convinced that that's what goes on.
Oh, I'm sure. No, we're a sex cult.
Everyone knows that handling snakes is a lot easier than handling Unitarian Universalists.
There you
Go.
Is that your, who's gone?
It's not my gong.
That is our chiming clock.
Ah, okay.
Okay, I got the door open.
Sometimes I unplug it when I'm doing something on Zoom. But there is a story to this, which may be an okay thing to start the evening off with. We bought this when we were in Boston. And one afternoon, I forget why Judy was in this particular neighborhood, but one afternoon, Judy was walking past the Boston Home for Aged Women, actual name of the place. And they were having a rummage sale. And she saw this mantel clock that reminded her so much of the one her grandmother had had. And I think it cost a grand total of $20 or $25. Even in 1964, that was a really reasonable price. So she bought it and brought it home under her arm, and it went on our mantle. And the first time her parents came to visit, they'd been there a few minutes, and the quarter hour came up, and it chimed. And her father wheeled around and said, "That thing reminds me of the damn clock my mother had." He said, you'd wake up in the middle of the night in the winter and hear it chime quarter past, and you had the awful choice of getting up in the cold, turning on a light to see quarter past what, or trying to stay awake for 45 minutes to chime the hour. So we always unplugged the clock when Judy's mom and dad came, because the clock that Judy remembered so fondly from her grandmother's was not remembered that fondly by her dad. So that's family history. No, that's fine. Anyhow, it's time for us to start. I'm glad to see so many folks here. This week, we are talking about acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And it's, as I was thinking about this, it's not absolutely crystal clear, just off the top of our heads, how these two connect. Acceptance of one another and spiritual growth in our congregations. I think there is a relationship. I think that part of our spiritual growth when it happens is because we do accept diversity. On our good days, we don't just accept it, we welcome it. And I think that's an important ingredient for each of us having some capacity to grow. Tonight, I'm going to be emphasizing mostly the acceptance of one another as we practice it more or less well in our congregations, because I think in presenting to the world, this is a very important thing that we do. And I think it shapes how we're seen by other people. So tonight we're going to be talking about ethnic Unitarian congregations. Topic I hadn't thought about until a few years ago. My friend, who thinks a lot and writes a fair amount, Mark Morrison Reed, reflected, and I don't remember if Mark wrote this or this was in a conversation. I think he wrote something about this. Mark at that point was serving our congregation in Toronto, Canada, co-minister with his wife. And he talked about looking out of their apartment window and seeing the buildings of various ethnic congregations there in Toronto, which is apparently a fairly diverse city, vibrantly diverse, I gather. And, the onion dome of the Greek Orthodox Church and the steeple of the Korean Christian Church and synagogues and a mosque and so on. And he got to thinking about it and began to think about whether we are an ethnic faith community. Maybe, as Mark thought about it, upper middle class New England ethnicity. And it is sort of true that in some ways, this is baked into our personality as congregations. An example that occurs to me, in 1985, I was called to the ministry of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Elkhart, Indiana. And one of the battles that I, as minister, had there was to break our habit of holding services through Memorial Day and then closing down, tight as a drum, till Labor Day. And I discovered this was not a battle that was going to be won. Just, brilliant new minister says, I don't think we should do this. No. It was met with, but we've always done this. And what was going on in some measure was a replication of the Boston Brahmin Church calendar. Many of the Boston Unitarian congregations shut their doors on Memorial Day and didn't open up again until Labor Day or after. In the 19th century, this was the practice because all the leading families in the church went to their summer place on Cape Cod. And there were churches on Cape Cod that only held services in the summer because, after the summer people went back to Boston, there weren't that many people around. So, Chatham and others, they didn't keep going. Very, very Boston. My first church was in the city limits of Boston. The community, the Protestant churches in the West Roxbury neighborhood had union services across the summer. Each one of us took 2 Sundays to hold services. And frankly, those were very lightly attended services. So, here I go to a fellowship founded in 1961 in Northern Indiana, and they're still doing the Boston calendar. That lends some credence to Mark Morrison Reed's thought that maybe we too are an ethnic church. New England, upper middle class ethnicity. But there are other vastly different ethnic Unitarian churches. And I hope you've all had a chance to read about the Finnish congregations in Minnesota. When I was asked to review this book, Missionaries, Builders, and Pathfinders, the chapter in here that really captivated me was the one that I shared an excerpt from about the congregations starting out in Virginia, Minnesota. And this ministerial couple who served there. Let me read you a little bit more from that chapter. This is an essay on religious belief and behavior in the book, Minnesota in a Century of Change, the State and Its People Since 1900. And there the author wrote, most Finns were associated with Finnish temperance societies or radical organizations. Temperance halls, begun as secular organizations, but quickly attracting the church Finns, were the primary forums where religiously oriented and radical Finns struggled with each other in the 1880s and 1890s to define the meaning of Finnish ethnic identity. A few exceptional individuals were able to reach out to both parties in ethnic rivalries. Among Finnish Americans, Milna Lapala was a striking example. Because the Virginia congregation took a free-thinking approach to theology, one that allowed integration of Christian tradition with contemporary political and philosophical thought, conservative Finns considered it anathema. And at the same time, radical Finns often viewed the church as a regressive force. Nevertheless, Lapala officiated at burials for both groups, and as well as for Finns not connected with any factions. Through her active ministry and community involvement, which spanned more than 30 years, Lapala contributed enormously to Finnish American life on the Iron Ranges. Cool story. And my experience has been that very often Unitarian and Universalist congregations.
So, and they didn't have ranch, so I did mayonnaise and chipotle sauce.
UU congregations do function as a place where people come for rites of passage. A significant number of our weddings are not for church families. When I had an intern in Elkhart, Indiana, I promised her she got first choice of any outside the congregation weddings that came up. And the only one that came our way that year turned out to be a real interfaith stretch. But where do an Italian Buddhist and a Northern Indiana Muslim go to find a wedding officiant? That's us. So, you know, that acceptance of one another, that you're okay, I'm okay, can be vitally important. And it winds up being important for funerals. But, I wanted to mention something else. I looked up the data on the Virginia, Minnesota congregation now. It's smaller than when the Lapalas were there. It has a grand total of 29 members reported to the UUA. Oh, you know, that's really small. How much can they do? Well, okay, that's 29 members in a community of 8,432 people. Actually, they have a higher percentage of the Virginia, Minnesota population than Tennessee Valley Unitarian Church has of the Knoxville population. 29 members in Virginia, Minnesota is not bad. That acceptance stuff, yeah, that works in a lot of ways. Now, I also strongly encouraged you to go to the website of the Nora Church in Hanska, Minnesota, and read that. And I hope that all of you had a chance to do that. That too is a fascinating history, another ethnic group, Norwegians in this case, getting tired of the very strict Norwegian Lutheran church in town and starting something new. And you know, how many of you did have a chance to read about the Nora Church? You know, hands? I hope you did. Okay. To give you a little bit more about what the Nora Church is like, I invited my next door neighbor in terms of Unitarian Universalist congregations when we were both in northern Indiana to join us tonight. So we have the Reverend Lisa Day with us. Lisa is now the minister in Hanska, Minnesota, and is able to tell us about what the Nora Church is like today, get us up to date on their windmill, and tell us how much they're tied into to their history. Good to have you with us, Lisa.
It's good to be with you, and I'm impressed how many people are in your class on a Friday night. This is awesome. I will give a brief recap since so many of you did not read the history. Maybe I'll start with the name. Nora simply means Norwegian. In Scandinavian folk history, there were three goddesses, Nora, Svea, and Dania, meaning Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And so our church is named for the goddess of Norway. Minnesota largely settled by Norwegians, and this part of the state was no different. There were actually two Lutheran churches sort of on either side of where we are now that had unhappy members. And unlike many of our churches in New England and in other places, the unhappiness was not theological. It was in terms of governance and power. Some people say the big issue was over who could be buried in the cemetery. Other people say it was over where the cemetery should be located. But there was definitely some power around the cemetery. Also, the unhappy folks in both Linden Lutheran Church and Lake Hanska Lutheran Church had been influenced by Ibsen and Bjornstjerne Bjornstjerne, who were radical poets and playwrights and thinkers back in Norway. And they had an interest in public school and in basically less authoritarian power in the churches. And so these folks had left their churches and had started to come together. They really had no intention at first of becoming anything other than Lutheran. And then their second intention was, okay, well, we won't affiliate with any church. So the first name of our church was Nora Free Christian Church. So you can see they were not leaving behind their Christian identity. But when we're looking for a minister, a famous Norwegian poet and writer, Christopher Jansen, had come through on the speaking circuit. And they heard him and they liked his ideas, and they'd heard he had been ordained in Minneapolis, and they asked him to be their minister. And the way I tell it, at least, he said, okay, but you know, I'm not Lutheran anymore, I'm Unitarian. And they said in 19th century Norwegian, whatever, you know, we like you. So Jansen was the first minister. He was never full-time here. He was serving a church in Minneapolis, and he came for the summers. And his successor, Amandus Norman, who stayed 25 years until he retired, also started out serving both the church in Minneapolis and the church here. That Minneapolis church eventually folded, and then Dr. Norman became the full-time minister here. I live in the parsonage that was built in 1906 for Dr. Norman and his family. So when I think about acceptance of one another, well, from the very beginning, their acceptance of of Christopher Jansen, saying, you know, we're Lutheran and that's all we're used to, but we sort of have these radical ideas, and if you can serve us, you know, it doesn't really matter to us if your theology is so different than what we're used to. And that sort of situation that plays out again and again. Most immediately following that, I couldn't find it. It's not in the history on our website, and it's not in the little history I was looking at just now, but at some place it's recorded that the members said, in our cemetery, we will bury even those people who said we couldn't be buried in their cemetery. So there was that openness, even to the people who were very strident in their disapproval of this church. When the church was first built, it was built at the very top of our property on a hill, and a tornado took it down before the first Sunday service could be held in it. And the surrounding Norwegians said, you know, well, you deserved it. That was God's retribution. So it was not an easy relationship with their neighbors, who were their kinsmen from the same valley back in Norway, and who were their family members. But and people in the church now still remember as children that there was that distrust and unkindness between the two congregations. Now, if you know anything about Jesse James and the James Gang, one of their most famous bank robberies was in Northfield, Minnesota, which is some distance east of here, but they were in fact captured in our neighborhood, just about 8 miles from here. And legend has it that one of the lesser of the James Gang is buried in our cemetery, that it was a place that would even bury a bank robber. And the reason we say, you know, that it's a legend and we're not really sure was because they probably, if it's true, they didn't really want the word out that they would have buried this individual. Coming up to more modern times, there is what was news to me, although I'm sure Gordon knew about it. In the 1960s, during the civil rights era, there were cruel pranks, is too minor a word, events called reverse freedom rides, where Black families would be put on a bus and sent north. Minnesota had an attorney general who spoke out in favor of civil rights, and so some of the white supremacists said, okay then, okay, you like them, we'll send them to you. And a woman and her children arrived on the Greyhound or whatever kind of bus it was in Redwood Falls, which is, I don't know, 40 or 50 miles north of here. having been promised a warm reception and a job and a place to live. And of course, none of that was forthcoming. The local community in Redwood Falls put out a call for clergy to help. And one of the few clergy members who answered the call was the minister of our church. And a young attorney from Redwood Falls then decided, well, that's where I'm going to raise my family. And his widow is still a member of our congregation. When I came here 11 years ago, Noah was pretty significantly into his dementia. So I heard the story often about how he and his family came to our church because Emo Gudmundsson, a good Icelandic Unitarian, was the minister and answered the call to help that family. Let's see, what else? To go back to the sort of rocky relationship between the Lutherans and the Unitarians. 17 Mai, 17 May, is an important holiday for Norwegians. It represents the day that Norway got its freedom from Sweden. Although, as I learned the first year it was my turn to preach, I studied it, and it turns out they weren't really free the year they declared their freedom. They weren't free for another 90 years, but they started celebrating. They celebrated it every year until it actually happened. So at any rate, big celebration in Hanska. And we're a town of 400. So when you talk about small, there's 400 people in Hanska. The Lutherans and the Unitarians take turns leading the Sunday worship service in the town park on 17 Mai, or the Sunday closest to 17 Mai, and everybody comes. So one year the Lutherans lead it, and one year the Unitarians lead it. And so when there were some new ministers in the Lutheran church, and they decided they would invite the Unitarian minister, my predecessor, to cooperate with them when it was their turn and plan the church service. And they served 4 small Lutheran churches in the neighborhood. And somebody from the board members from one of their churches came to them with the bylaws that said, you can't cooperate with the Unitarians. And that was in their bylaws. So they all come to the worship service, whether I'm leading it or they're leading it, but actually cooperating to put on sort of an interfaith service, that was banned in the bylaws. So long memories, as I think there are most places. Now, Gordon mentioned the New England upper, middle, upper class ethnicity. I grew up in a large Unitarian church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And for years and years, I don't know if it's still the case, but they would have their congregational meeting, and the parliamentarian of that meeting would be a judge who was a member of the congregation. Now, not the same judge, mind you, year after year, just one of the judges who was a member of that congregation. Now, we did have a judge. In fact, the Noah, who I mentioned earlier with dementia, was eventually, he turned from a young lawyer into an elderly judge. But we also have a lot of farmers and over-the-road truck drivers and a couple of teachers, but not as many as you would find in a typical Unitarian Universalist church. So, everywhere people are surprised, oh, there's a Unitarian church in Hanska. Yes, in fact, we're surrounded by cornfields or soybean fields on 3 sides. And they think, well, that must be new. And it's like, no, we've been here since 1881. So it is, we deviate from that New England ethnicity a little bit and instead have our Norwegian ethnicity. And to tie it into spiritual growth, I'm going to see if I can pull up my virtual background, and I'm going to show you 2 of them. I think I've got them both. Okay, so there, you can see, if I can move out of the way. that's what you would see behind the pulpit most Sundays in the church. But some Sundays you would see this. That is what we were known for years and years, and in some places we're still known for it. A huge portrait of Jesus behind the pulpit at the front of the church. For years, there were also blue velvet curtains that could be closed so that Jesus was not visible, or open so that Jesus was visible. Jesus's presence here shows that our ties, to Christianity. The fact that he could be visible or not visible shows that the theology did evolve. Some of my predecessors, well, in fact, I did the same, decided they were never going to touch the curtains, and they were either but they opened and closed. Somebody else did it from time to time. When I got here, the curtains had been burned. They scorched in a service. They caught fire, but the scorch marks didn't show if they were open. So for months, I didn't have to worry about it. Jesus was just always there. And then they built those doors that looked just right, like the rest of the, So now we can have Jesus or not have Jesus because we open or close the doors. I make sure Jesus is there for Easter and Christmas. I always ask families who are having a funeral or a wedding. Some people have a really strong opinion one way. Other people have a really strong opinion the other way. But it's never contentious. Just sometimes Jesus is visible and sometimes Jesus isn't visible. And I think that, that says something about spiritual growth. And again, that we were not founded on theological differences, but on differences of governance and power, so that we really, from the very beginning, have had this expansive and not the anti-Christian sentiment that is found, certainly not in all Unitarian Universalist churches, but in some. Mm-hmm. That is much less present here.
Yeah.
Now we're also known for the wind tower. Gordon mentioned that. I arrived here 11 years ago. The congregation was in the middle of a process of deciding whether or not to have some alternative source of energy. They commissioned a study. Solar was rejected right away. That wasn't good for our property. The final decision was between geothermal and wind. Geothermal would have been good because it, gives you what you need. I mean, right there you have the heating or the cooling, but it requires lots of retrofitting, and we've got a parsonage built in 1906 and a church built in 83, and that just wasn't in the cards. Electricity is easy to move around, but we don't heat with electricity. We still heat with liquid propane, but we will eventually, transfer as we have to replace appliances and various things, move over toward electricity. It's been going now for 7-8 years, and we produce more than what we use. Most months we get a check back from the utility. During the summer, it's a very small. In fact, this month, August, maybe we won't get any, both because the wind, there's a lot less wind in July and August, and I use the air conditioning in the parsonage. So, but most of the year we get a little bit of credit back on our utility bill because we can sell it.
Yeah.
So that's Nora.
Yeah, that indicates that there is some considerable growth that has happened over the years as the congregation has adapted and fit itself to the situations there.
Right.
Yeah.
And we could one up Virginia in terms of our percentage of the population, because I think we have 47 members in a town of 400, but most of our people don't come from Hanska. We have people who come from almost as far west as South Dakota, 30 miles to the east, and so we have a very wide circle we draw. Because the nearest congregation to the west is Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
That does stretch things.
It does.
It does indeed. I think I recall reading, as I looked at the website, that you do have a structure on site that contains local
Yes.
memorabilia.
We have a little museum. So we have both a 21st century wind tower and a little log cabin that was not originally on this site. Someone gave it to us and it was moved here. And in that we have both church artifacts and community. We have the switchboard from Hanska, for example, is in there. Some trunks that would have been used by Norwegians emigrating to the United States, several spinning wheels, a couple of items that nobody can tell me what they are, and various other little voting boxes. They have a handle, and then there's a box and a hole for the marble, so you vote with a black or white marble. Newspaper clippings, a lot of Norwegian books, song books and prayer books. And the first 3 ministers preached in Norwegian. So we have a lot of Norwegian, and there's a full shelf of books here in my study that I can't read. They just came with the study. They're Norwegian.
Oh, questions for Lisa. Digging deeper into this fascinating culture. I see Judy. Unmute. Yeah.
Lisa, I have to ask.
Oh, hi, Judy.
Jesus is very often clearly a white European in pictures. And
Right.
Do I assume that the Jesus behind you is Norwegian looking?
He's not blonde, but yeah, sort of light brown hair and light skinned. Right. And it's the front of our sanctuary looks like the front of the Lutheran sanctuary in town and several other Norwegian churches with the white altar piece and a big painting of Jesus. That's a very typical touch.
Oh.
I'll follow up with, have the people in the congregation tied into any of the discussions of Black Lives Matter and the movement within our country right now? Not that it's going to make them want to paint Jesus differently, but just I was just wondering if you're seeing discussion there.
There's a great deal of interest, both in our congregation and then so the nearest city to us is New Ulm, and a city of 12,000. And there is a small, active Black Lives Matter type group in New Ulm, and church members are active in that. And letters to the editor and trying to vote in, various more liberal candidates in our local state elections. So yeah, definitely. I see somebody wrote a question.
Oh, yes, I haven't been monitoring the chat.
They do not, I don't know anything about that Black family. I don't know if they stayed in Redwood Falls. They certainly aren't members of our church. I could ask, I'll ask Noah's widow if she knows what happened there. And the theological differences, let me see what that said.
Yeah.
This is, well, of course, none of the people living in the congregation now were alive during the split, because that was 1881. But there are folks who came from other churches, just like there are in most Unitarian. We have fifth and fourth and third generation families, so we've got people whose ancestors were founders. I served for 11 years in northern Indiana in a sort of fellowship type congregation, and then I went and did an interim for 2 years in a small former fellowship in the Twin Cities. And then I came here, and I've been here now 11 years. And there is less theological wrangling or dissatisfaction or complaining here than any place I have ever been. Whatever, you know, there's a couple people who won't come to Christmas Eve because it's Christmas, you know, I do Christmas Eve, it's Christmas Eve. So we tell the story of the Nativity. And there are people, like I say, would rather never see Jesus, but I never have anyone coming and saying, oh, the theists are getting too much airtime, or the atheists are getting too much airtime, or why do we have too many God hymns? That simply does not happen. It's sort of amazing to me, coming from where I came from. Thank you for that question. I like to brag about these people in that regard.
Lisa and I exchange pulpits pretty regularly, and yes, this is definitely not South Bend, Indiana.
It's not. I did have someone come. I'm on the rotation for the pastor's column in 2 different small town newspapers. Not in Hanska because they don't have a pastor column, but so when we were working toward marriage equality here, which we got before it became, you know, the law of the land, someone did come to church on a Sunday morning from St. James, where I had written a column, to tell me that I would find out at the white throne of God how wrong I was. And I said, well, one of us will find out. And he said, I'm not joking. And I said, I know you're not, and nor am I. And when I wrote recently about Black Lives Matter, someone called me right away the morning the paper was published to say how much he appreciated the column. And he said, because you're going to hear bad things, so I want you to know. Now, I don't happen to subscribe to any of those papers. So if there are letters to the editor in response to my columns, I don't know. So. Well, we have a better sitting to my service. Of course we do. Because I work really hard at, I think a strength of Unitarian Universalism is that we can speak the language. You know, I can preach in a way that is perfectly acceptable to Lutherans and to Unitarian Universalists. I can do that translating. Also, I take a great deal of pride in, I speak to the occasion. The Lutheran minister will preach on the lectionary, and I preach about Sit and Demai, but make it applicable to our lives today. So I think our services are better.
This sounds like a wonderfully plugged into our principles Unitarian Universalist congregation.
So, yeah.
Grown from a bunch of people who didn't like authoritarians in the church that they'd been in. And they chose not to run their church that way.
Right, and yet they are amazingly not anti-clerical. You know, they're not. They don't have that. So they built a church that was open and women always had the vote, and it was, you know, very egalitarian, but their distrust of authority did not lead them to distrust clergy, which, you know, is nice for me.
Yes, it's always pleasant when you and I and Jametta enter a congregation and there's not instant distrust because, well, you have a title.
Right.
So, yeah. And Lisa mentioned that there are Icelandic Unitarian churches. I think of them primarily up in Manitoba.
Right.
But we do have these interesting pockets of ethnic history that is not New England upper middle class. Basically, our congregations thrive when they are open, accepting alternatives. And that may go especially when they're in a somewhat conservative context, where, yes, there is some pushback. There may be a church that has in its bylaws that their minister may not interact with with us. And I think one of the functions we've often served in any number of situations is being a bridge, spanning some of the differences in the community. It's been wonderful in a lot of my experience to be treated as, oh, okay, well, you can be here and that makes us inclusive. And it's been true. I remember in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, making the suggestion that really the ministerial group in Elkhart, Indiana should, have some dialogue with the Muslim community. And everybody said, yes. Okay. Who knows any Muslims? Well, okay, me, because there were Muslims in Elkhart County who didn't want to go all the way over to South Bend to St. Joseph County for community events, and they needed someplace they could rent that they felt secure in. We didn't have big religious symbols that they would have to sort of avoid seeing. So, yes, we did know Muslims. I remember Lisa's predecessor in South Bend went into hospital chaplaincy and was able to be a real assist to people of non-mainstream Christian faiths. A Muslim woman who had real reservations about having a male nurse do anything with her. And Susan could explain this as a religious issue. It's not anything against you personally, she could tell the nurse. It's a religious value that she feels a real need to observe. I think, okay, I see some Yeah, okay. Judy can unmute and ask another question.
I'm going to draw your attention, Gordon, to the fact that there are some questions in the group
Okay,
chat.
yes, I was going to go there. You know, Marion on Beck, I'm not going to ask John McNair's question. I think I know the answer. Who has better in my services? But Marion asked, I wonder if discomfort with authoritarianism is the main thing we have in common that binds our other diversities. That's interestingly thought-provoking. What do others of you think about that? Soraya said, I think I would agree to some degree. So, is our aversion to authoritarianism what holds us together? Do we have more than that? I think that's certainly an element.
I think we must have more than that because otherwise we would fall apart.
Yeah.
More than we do. But I think that is definitely what a lot of folks who come to us have in common.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not all of us, you know, you and me and Judy accepted, grew up Unitarian Universalist. And so a lot of the people who didn't, not always, but often it was some relationship to authoritarianism that sort of pulled them out of wherever they were and toward us.
Yeah. And Chaz asks a relevant question for almost any of our churches. Our church and the congregation as a whole struggles to become more diverse. Mostly that seems to mean wanting to bring in more people of color as well as LGBTQ members. This is at least in part to be more reflective of our communities at large. Is this an issue in Hanska? Yeah. Is this a relevant question for such a Scandinavian area?
It is. For a long time, the diversity was that New Ulm, that city I mentioned, which is where my daughter goes to school and, you know, where the grocery stores are. New Ulm is German. So, you know, there was both cultural exchange and also cultural clashes between the Norwegians and the Germans. There is, of course, we're on native land here, and occasionally on the cemetery we'll dig up some bones and need to call in the folks from the Sioux, the Upper Sioux Reservation, to invite them to dispose of or relocate bones. There is the same sort of desire that there is any place else. We've got to become more diverse. Why don't we have more color in our LGBTQ? A little bit less because we have folks come and go in that regard. Recently, within the past 2 years, a church member who grew up in Hanska, you know, sent me an email, said, you know, a Black family moved into Hanska. I've seen the kids around. You need to go visit them and invite them to our church. And I didn't because, you know, maybe they need our church and maybe they don't, but they don't need us inviting them to our church just because they're Black. So we to be available and opening and welcome and not fill our pews with people to make us feel good. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I do think that it's important that we buck authoritarianism. Obviously, most of us do not have a warm feeling about things authoritarian, and certainly don't want that in our religious community. But I think it's also important that we stay open, that we do that bridging. And I think we have certainly moderated the any New England upper middle class ethnicity that may have been more typical of late 19th, early 20th century. Certainly one factor in that was the fellowship movement that Lisa mentioned and I mentioned, that allowed congregations to spring up and be lay-led. And this, it didn't break the mold, but it expanded the mold. But I hope retained some of the inclusion, some of the positive. And I think it's extraordinarily important that we be able to do the sort of interfaith work, alternating with the Lutherans in that special service in May. I think of the very good experiences. I think of such things as Jametta and I got to know each other as we arranged a service observing the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last full day of life. And this crossed, the planning committee had Baptists and MCC and UU, and we worked and produced, as I recall, one very good service. Actually thinking back, I remember that first congregation I served in the Boston area, and one of the artifacts I have from that is this little tchotchke, Prayer of St. Francis. That was a gift from my colleague, Monsignor Finn. Monsignor Finn was in his 90s when I arrived in West Roxbury. He had two claims to fame that we heard about. He had been the advisor to the Newman Club at Harvard when Joseph Kennedy, not young Joe, who was shot down in World War II, Papa Joe was the student president of the Newman Club. And then Monsignor Finn had been rector of the seminary in Boston when a young man named Richard Cushing had been a student for the priesthood. Well, at this point, Richard Cushing was no longer a young student. He was Cardinal Cushing, who had delivered the invocation at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. So Monsignor Finn was a presence, and I cherish that he gave me that prayer of St. Francis. I also cherish a memory of one day, one afternoon, I was at the Gulf oil station, topping off the gas tank, and Monsignor Finn came by on his afternoon walk. At his age, he had to work at staying in good shape, and he related the latest from the council meeting in that John Paul XXIII had convened in Rome, and said, they tell us we no longer have to give up meat on Fridays. We're getting almost as bad as the Unitarians. These are precious relationships that it's possible for our congregations to have with the rest of the world. This is part of our spiritual growth. It's part of what we do, I think, to help the broader community have some spiritual growth. So, our little bit. Let me leave you with a teaser for next month. On the 7th, we're going to be, okay, before I do that, I see Soraya wanting to propose an alternative.
Oh, hi, thank you, Gordon. Sorry to interject, but I just think a lot of these conversations come about organically. And I think a lot of times when we're faced with situations like the one Lisa was in, where we're thinking, it would be a very good idea to come invite someone, and we might second guess that because it might seem like our motives are, elsewhere. When these organic conversations come about, it's better if you're already exposed to the type of people who you'd like to invite. And so I'm wanting to take an active role in this as well at TVUUC. And I think it's just easier when you're surrounded by people. They naturally talk to you. You naturally talk about, your faith or what you're involved in or your kids and things like that. These conversations come up. I think it might be a bit more organic if someone would be like, wow, something just hit me from a conversation that I had at TVUUC, and you just reminded me about that, which it was a real, this is an actual thing that happened to me. And I was like, you really should come with me. It's just been amazing. And, they told me their story, like, oh, we don't really, go or like organized religion, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I think you might have a different idea about this place. And my friend's family is coming. And so I think, and they're not Black, but I think it would work if, you were surrounded. The thing is, I think sometimes we get so isolated with people that look like us and so isolated with people that think like us that we don't put ourselves in such uncomfortable situations with people who don't think like we do and who don't look like we do. So I think it might be a bit more organic if you were to have to open up some more avenues where, I mean, I'm not, judging. You might be surrounded, tons by other people, that don't look or think like you, but I'm just saying that it might be a bit easier to do that in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
I encourage our folks often when they talk about, because, only having 50 members, they're really concerned about growth as well as diversity. And I say, every time you do something, you write a letter to the editor, you say, and this is related to my faith as a Unitarian Universalist. Yeah. And when you're talking with someone about Black Lives Matter or about keeping the schools open or closed because of COVID, you say, and at my church, we had this, mention in all of those conversations, you tie it to your faith, because that's the way that people are going to get interested, is if you're already in a conversation about something that is important to both of you.
Yeah, a common ground. Yes, ma'am.
Right. And I recently took a second job as the librarian of our small one-room library because the church can't necessarily support me anymore. And so I'm looking forward to that, increasing my exposure to all the different kinds of people that are in our little town that don't necessarily come to the church. And I think there'll be some cross-fertilization going on.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Soraya, for the insight that, I share your viewpoint that organic is far and away the best. So, Yes. Next month, we are going to be playing with hymns and some of the hymn writers across our history. We'll get to meet Samuel Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's kid brother, and probably at least 2 other interesting people and some of the material they wrote. So that's what's up for the next edition of History 7, and looking forward to seeing all of you. That one won't be on a Friday night. Of course, with the pandemic, who has exciting Friday night plans? I'm staying at home in a whole new way this Friday night. So look forward to seeing all of you then. And
Thank you,
delighted
Lisa.
to have you
Thank
here
you, Gordon.
Thank you. It was good to be with you.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the
Thank
rest
you
of
for
your
coming,
session.
Lisa.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Lisa.
Thank you.
Here.
Welcome.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Making
you.
sure everybody's
Kathy. Oops.
Chris, are you stuck? I don't know where Allie is. Her picture's been there for a while. And Elsie?
Yes, Ilse posted that she had just gotten home from work and
I can.
threw a pizza in the oven.
Okay, yes, and beer. So I didn't want to.
Oh, that's okay.
And my chair is like fine to see this, but the camera, I only always am seen from the side. Unless I sit on some kind of huge cushion. So anyway,
Well,
thank you. And I represent the Scandinavian contingency at TVUC. Okay.
well,
But not Norwegian.
I'm glad you got to hear that there's some kinfolk out there.
Yeah, no, I'm the Swede.
Yeah.
Close, but
Okay, you're one of the ones who oppressed the Norwegians. Okay. Yeah.
yes, I guess so. For which the celebration was held, right?
Yes.
Yes. Are you co-host, Gordon? Because Mark said he made me co-host, but I don't think I can shut down the meeting.
Yeah. Well, I think Jametta and I may have been left with that.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure what to do because I don't want to leave and then leave you there without being able to end it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I am assuming that Mark has gone on his way.
Okay. What happens when you push leave meeting? Does it say end meeting for all?
Yeah. Well, let's see.
I guess not.